Well, good morning. Happy Memorial Day weekend to everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Sunday morning service. It's Memorial Day weekend. That's a 3-day weekend for most everyone. It's been beautiful weather. We can't complain about that. I want to say thank you for all the birthday wishes that you guys all sent to me. I felt very blessed. Carl and I had a really good day. We drove to the coast. It was so cold we came home to have our picnic in our backyard. We also got to see our oldest granddaughter graduate from high school. They live streamed it, so we were able to be a part of that. So we've had a pretty good weekend. I hope you guys are having one too. Hope you have the ribs on the barbecue and just going to enjoy the 3-day weekend. I just have a couple of things to go over. The men's meeting is still Monday nights on Zoom. If you want to be a part of that, let Pastor Carl or Pastor Carlos know. They'll hook you up with that. The ladies group is taking a break until after the 4th of July, so if you'd want to join us then, let me know or let Deanne know and we'll get you hooked up. Next week is our Communion Sunday, and we've actually decided we're going to barbecue some hot dogs and hamburgers. So if you want to join us in the parking lot, we'd love to have you be a part of that and take communion with us also. Lastly, I just have to mention the tithes and offerings. It's regular tithes and offerings this week. Anything you can possibly give would be really appreciated. You know we're hurting financially and we're trying to keep the lights on here at the Father's House. You can go to thefathershouse.org, hit on the giving button, set it up that way. If you would like to do that and are having trouble doing that, you can give Carl or I a call too, and we'd love to walk you through the steps. You can do it as a one-time gift or a recurring gift. You can mail a check to the Father's House at 133 Bernal Road, San Jose, California, 95119. Or if you live in the area, since Gracie and CR are back from Hawaii, we're not going to get their contribution from them. But if you live in the area and you'd like us to come by and pick up your tithe, we'd be happy to do that and just say hi. So with that all said, again, we appreciate anything you can give. And now we will turn the time over to our guest speaker, John Mark.
Well, good morning, Father's House. It's good to be back with you again. It's been a week since we last got together. I'm glad to be here with you again during this special time, Memorial Day weekend. And I trust that a lot of you will be watching by way of video as opposed to in church, because a lot of you will probably be out enjoying the weather, enjoying the long weekend, and enjoying your family, which is always a good time. Anyway, again, my name is John Mark. I go by the name of Mark. And it's true that I'm a disciple of Jesus, and I was a follower of Jesus. And I followed Jesus firsthand. I walked with him. I talked with him. I observed all that he said and all that he did. And I wrote my testimony as to why I believe that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. And that's from here at the Father's House, been under a special invitation. You guys have invited me to come and tell you my story, my testimony about this man, Jesus, and how he profoundly changed not only my life, but the life of all of the people that he touched. Up to this point, we've been really talking about the miracles that Jesus had done and how those things actually pointed towards the fact that he was the Son of God. But today we're going to take a big turn in the life of Jesus. We're going to touch on it for a little bit, and hopefully next week, if you'll have me back, then what I'll do is I'll be able to talk a little bit more about it as we begin into almost the closing of one chapter of what I want to talk today about in Jesus' life and about the opening of a new one. So as you remember, last week we left off with the Syrophoenician woman, the woman that was not a Jew, and we were way up in the area of Tyre, which is quite a ways from Galilee, where Jesus was staying and where he did most of his ministry. And while we were up there, remember that it was that Jesus broke every barrier that there was to break in touching a demonized daughter of a Syrophoenician woman. And he broke every barrier because he broke the ethnic barrier. He broke the gender barrier. He broke the religious barrier in doing all that he did, basically saying that the thing that matters the most is not what faith tradition somebody belongs to, not what color their skin is, not what region they're from, what nation they're from, But what matters is that they understand that God's desire is to heal all people. And healing is all the children's bread, not just some of the children's bread. We talk about that, and if you want to, you can go back and look at last week when we talked about it, and that would be fine, and I think that you might glean something from that. But this week I kind of want to continue with just a few of the miracles as we begin to close this out, and as I said, turn the journey a different direction. So after that, and coming back to, on our way back to the Galilee area from being up in the area that we were up in, Tyre and Sidon, and as we were coming back, there was a man that was both deaf and dumb, which dumbness, not being able to speak for the most part, not dumb in the mind, but dumb meaning not being able to speak, which is a completely different thing. And what that is a byproduct really of not being able to hear, because if you can hear, then you can enunciate sound. But if you can't hear, then it's very difficult for you to enunciate sound. Now, I know that in your society that you have many, many technologies and techniques that you can use to teach people that. But in our day, that wasn't true. It just wasn't the case. And there was a case where a man came forward that was dumb and deaf, or deaf and dumb, really, and asked that Jesus would heal him, or the people asked that Jesus would heal him. Jesus did it a little bit different this time. Usually he just said, be healed, or they touched the hem of his garments and they were healed. But this time, Jesus stuck his fingers into his ears and then spit into his hand and touched his tongue and said, be opened, meaning his ears. And immediately his ears were opened. And as his ears opened, he was amazed, and he was so amazed by it that he just couldn't believe what it was that had happened. And so they begin to ask him words. They'd be like, can you say the word, like say Bob? Can you say Bob? And he'd say, but Bob. And so what you found is there was this connection between him learning how to speak, because for the first time he was hearing. And that's a physical thing that happened, but there is a spiritual component to that. And that's the idea of hearing and speaking. Sometimes we hear things in the physical, but we don't hear things in the spiritual. And I think that what this miracle is, as much as it was a miracle about physical healing, it kind of transitions over into our lives by way of spiritual healing. And when we hear spiritual things, we're able to talk about spiritual things. But when we close our ears off to them, we remain deaf to those things. How can we speak of anything spiritual when our ears aren't hearing those things that are of the essence and of the mind of God? A second one that he did, which is really kind of a big one, and it kind of is something that I want to spend a little bit of time talking about today. It has to do with the feeding of 4,000 this time. It was different than the feeding of 5,000 in some ways, and in other ways it was the same. Number one, there was different amount of people that were involved. And this time the people had actually even been there a little bit longer. They had been, when Jesus came back, as I said, the people were just all over him all the time. They couldn't get enough of him because they were getting touched. They were getting healed. They were seeing all these miracles. And they were in wonder because everything that Jesus did, he did well. All things that he did, when it was healing people, when he talked, when he loved, whatever the case was, he always did things well. Well, the people were getting hungry, and this time, rather than us even wanting to suggest to Jesus that he ought to send them away into other villages, we simply just waited to see what he would do. And finally he came to us and said, it's the people are getting hungry, they're getting tired, but I don't want to send them away, because if I send them away, and many of them haven't eaten in 3 days, then they're going to get faint on the way home. So I think that we should feed them. And again, the disciples, the 12 of us, we kind of think that's kind of crazy. We'd seen it once. And so he said, how many loaves do you have? And this time, rather than having 5 loaves, there were 7 loaves. And rather than and there was a couple of fish, so we had a couple of fish as well. And again, Jesus did the exact same thing. And he broke the bread. And after breaking the bread, he gave it to the disciples, and they just continued to feed the people the same way with the fish. And all the people were fed again. This time when he commanded us to go pick up the baskets, however, there weren't 12 that were left, but there were 7 that were left. I could get into explaining what I think that means, but I think we should probably leave that for now so I can continue with the story, because I think these things come into focus when we talk a little bit more about where Jesus wants to go with his disciples and what he wants to say to them next. So after that, we got into a boat, and as we got into a boat and we were traveling to go away to a private place by ourselves, and quite frankly, this was one of those times where we were actually going to be able to spend some time alone. And while we were in the boat and we were headed to the other side, I can tell you that we forgot to take bread with us. Now, but we had given the people bread, but because we were in this remote area, we didn't have a lot of bread either. And so rather trying to find bread to take with us, we had this one loaf for all of us. We got into the boat and we began to go to the other side. And so as we were going across the other side, Jesus looked at us and he said, I want you to beware of the leaven of Herod and the Pharisees. Well, those amongst us in the boat that heard this, we were inquiring about ourselves, and people around were inquiring about themselves as to what it was that Jesus meant when he said this, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, or leaven of Herod, or Herod and the Pharisees. What was he saying by that? And everybody got started to think, well, maybe it's because we didn't bring any bread. And so he's talking about bread. And Jesus, hearing their conversation and realizing that they still didn't understand, said, how is it that you still don't understand? He said, can I ask you a question? When I fed the 5,000, how much food did we use? And how much bread was left over? And they gave the answer. And how much, after we fed these 4,000, how much did we use? And how much was left over? Which was always more than it was used. And so Jesus was saying, if I could take care of the 5,000 and the 4,000, and we could feed them with 7 loaves and a few fish, or 5 loaves and 2 fish, what makes you think that we couldn't turn that 1 loaf of bread into enough for all of us to eat? And he was basically saying, I'm your sustenance here. I take care of the people. I can feed the people because I'm of the divine mind. And so for us to worry about that is unnecessary. And what he was really saying there, in some instances, he was talking about something completely not physical, but he was talking about that which is spiritual. Let me explain. Whenever you take a lump of flour and you want to make it into bread, as you know, as we all know, one of the first things you're going to do to get that bread to puff up and be a nice loaf of not dense flour is that you're going to put a little yeast into it. And just a small amount of yeast in time in that loaf of dough is going to proof that dough, ferment that dough, bring air into that dough so it begins to rise. So even though you use a little bit of yeast, eventually it affects the whole loaf. We've talked about this before. And so Jesus says this at several different times, and maybe we'll talk about this a little bit later, about the kingdom of heaven being like leaven that was put into loaves, and we kind of talked about that a little bit. But in this instance, he's talking about a different leaven. He's not talking about the yeast of God. He's talking about the yeast of men. He's talking about the yeast of men that is that which sees spiritual matters by way of, I don't know what you would call it, politically motivated movements. Or thinking that we can do it by forcing our society to change one way or the other. And I realize that at this time, in this society, we see a lot of protests going on and a lot of civil unrest. And you almost wonder to what end it will all come about. But Jesus is looking past that and saying that ultimately the kingdom of God and spiritual things aren't contained in that. He says, and the second thing is beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which was a completely different leaven. You see, you can have that leaven that makes you politically active or angry at what's going on in society or wanting to act and do things. But there's a second type of leaven that he wants us to be aware of, which is that religious leaven that seeks to oppress, that seeks to constrain, and seeks to dominate rather than free people. And we see that really through the life of the Pharisees up to the point of what I've talked about today. When we think about how they were beginning to challenge Jesus over everything, about the way that his disciples didn't wash, about the way that they didn't observe the Sabbath, the way that he healed on the Sabbath. And you see, that was that leaven of control. Well, you've got to be like us or you're not a child of God. You've got to do the things that we do or we're going to be suspect that you're even from God. And what Jesus was saying was, I want you to beware of those things that are religious and those things that are carnal, those things that are of the flesh. And I want you to focus on the leaven that is spiritual, rather than this hyper religion, which is all this external stuff to make a person feel like they're right with God when they're really not. And on the other side of getting involved in thinking that our fight in all of society is done on the carnal level without the help of God and without understanding spiritual truths. There's two different kinds of leaven there. Hope you get that. There's this secular, fleshly stuff, political stuff, social stuff. And then there's this religious stuff that looks like it's from God. It looks like it's got the form of it, but it doesn't find its basis for existence in God. How can I better describe this? Because I understand this is a little bit difficult. Well, let's put it this way. Anything that we do spiritually, religiously, let's put it that way, or anything that we do socially should always find its root in people that are centered in a spirituality that understands the ideas and the mind and the concepts of God. And out of those concepts that are in it, we move into social arenas. We bring social justice. It is out of what's in us that we promote religious practices that are non-oppressive, that are non-sectarian, that don't marginalize somebody because they don't believe like we do. It almost goes back to not making everybody that's not a faith, part of our faith tradition, a Syrophoenician woman who has a demonized daughter. Because you see, it's the center of what we ought to do is that which God puts in us by way of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, long-suffering, virtues. And with the virtues that come prudence, justice, courage, and temperance. Because when those things are in us, because God is for those and about those become the extension in our religious life and the extension in our social life. And Jesus is saying, don't mistake this action in the social arena and don't mistake the forms of religion for the leaven that you ought to be partaking of. Well, I could go on a little bit more about that, but I think I'm going to leave that and I'm going to go on to this turning of a chapter in the life of Jesus, in the life of the disciples. I could tell you another story about the healing of a man born blind that happened after the feeding of the 4,000 and us moving into and away into a retreat time with Jesus. But I'll save that story. It was just a story again about how he had healed a blind man. And this time again, by using his hands and dirt and spitting on his hands and making almost a mud out of them and applying them as a salve onto his eyes, and the blind man saw. There's a lot we could talk about that, but I'll let that go because there's a significant part that I want to talk about today, which I think is the most important as we go forward so we understand what it is that this person of Jesus and what it is that God had in mind in sending Jesus. So Jesus took the disciples away. And while they were alone by themselves, not a lot of people around, Jesus began to ask the disciples several questions. Now, I want to tell you something, that whenever Jesus asked a question, the same way that whenever God asks a question, they're not empty questions. He's not just asking a question to have a conversation. He's not going to ask, what's the weather like today? And what's the weather going to be like tomorrow? He's going to ask several questions that have profound repercussions for those that will answer them. And so he says to the disciples, first question is, he says, who do the people say that I am? And the disciples thought for a minute, and they'd heard it. I mean, they'd heard everybody talk. They knew more than probably Jesus did, but Jesus had probably heard it as well. And they said, well, some say that you're John the Baptist risen from the dead. We've talked about that, like Herod thought. Some think that you're Elijah the prophet. You're the prophet of old. And all of these different things about you're a great teacher and all these things that Jesus could be. And in some cases, he was a great teacher and he was a prophet. He wasn't John the Baptist because they existed at the same time together for one reason. But even by and large, a part of that, because Jesus' ministry was very unique in what God was doing. And in all of those different questions, there was going on in their mind of all these things that people thought that Jesus or who Jesus was. And then Jesus says, I understand all the people thinking all of those things of me, and I'm okay with that. But who do you say that I am? Now, Jesus had turned the conversation off of what the people thought, and he began to ask his disciples this very pointed question about, who do you say I am? Now, in reading the story or hearing the story, we could probably sit there and say, well, it's easy. We could just tell them. We could tell them, and if we were there, we would be able to just tell them, who we thought he was. That would be easy. But you see, we have all the story. They didn't have all of the story. They didn't know how the story finished yet, did they? Now, they had seen all these things that he had done. And that's what Jesus was really pointing to. It's almost like when Jesus asked that question, he was asking it in a lengthened form. He said, I want to ask you, who do you say I am? And he said, think about this. After the blind man can see, after the leopard is healed, after the crippled can walk, after people's sins have been forgiven, feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000, the walking on water, the healing of the blind man, the opening of the eyes, or opening of the ears of the deaf, setting people free that are in mental torment. In all that you've seen, who do you say that I am? I don't think that the disciples answered that question quickly. I think there was a lot of silent time, a lot of thinking. Nobody really wanted to answer. How do you answer that question? Peter finally spoke up and he said, well, Jesus, I think you're the Christ. I think you're the Messiah. And Jesus looked at him and said, Peter, you've answered this correctly. There's a lot more I can do to talk about this, and a lot more we're going to talk about concerning this statement and this question and statement about who you say that I am. But I want to leave it there right now until next week, because we're at a critical juncture in the life of Jesus And we're at a critical juncture, even as I'm here with you today, as I want to ask you the question: who do you think that Jesus Christ is? Now, I know I've told you about his miracles, all the things that he said and did. I understand that. And you could make the argument back to me that you weren't there. It's hearsay because I'm saying that. But I guess the bigger question is, and it doesn't matter it doesn't matter how long you've been a Christian or a follower of Jesus Christ or not a Christian. Every one of us have had experiences of some kind with God. So based off of the experiences we've had, maybe when we were in our darkest hours, he was there. Maybe when we needed financial help, he was there. Maybe when we needed peace in the midst of a divorce or in the midst of a conflict or the loss of health or a loved one, we found God meeting us right where we were and taking care of our needs. You see, there comes a time in all of our lives, not just the disciples, where he asked us the profound question: who do you say that I am? It's not a question of your religious faith tradition. It's not a question of what your political views are and where society is. It's a question about who is God and how do you see God in your life. How do you see Jesus Christ? Do you see him as a good teacher? If so, follow him. As a prophet, then perhaps heed the message of God. If you saw him as John the Baptist, then his message of repentance would apply. But if you see him as the Christ, the light of God, the very light of God, it has spiritual ramifications. And I want to tell you that when you come to the realization through everything you've seen, everything you know, and you simply, in your innermost being, in your heart of hearts, you simply say, I know and I believe that you are who you say you are, and you're the Messiah of God. When we come to that point in our spiritual journey, when we come to that realization at that point, it's like saying inside of us, I know this, that nothing else in all of the earth or anything that will ever exist in my life in the future, the same way that in the past or in the present, is more real than the fact that you're God, you're the Messiah, and you're here to lead me into truth. The day that we say that, the day we have that conviction deep inside, and not just this external thing, God begins to do a new work and a deeper work in us. We're going to see that in coming days. As we talk more about Jesus, we're going to see that Jesus is now turning a corner. We're going to see less of the miracles and more of the focus on what he came to do, what he came to teach, and the people he came to transform to carry on that message. The message for the disciples going forward is completely different than it was in the past because they believed. Jesus is now going to show them many profound truths that are going to be very hard for them to understand, very difficult for them. And ultimately, it's going to cost them the rest of their life in service to him. And for the most part, at the end of it all, it's going to cost them their very life, the same way it did Jesus. But we'll save that story. The question today is one thing, and the warning is another. The warning is, beware of the leaven. Beware of what you put into your dough. Sow the spiritual stuff. Sow Jesus Christ in his teachings, and you'll find the right leaven in your loaf. That's the warning. And the challenge is, and the question is, today, who do you say that he is? After the blind eyes have seen? Has he opened your spiritual ears? Maybe your physical ears. Has he healed you? Has he fed you? Has he clothed you? Has he forgiven your sin? In the times that you were completely down and discouraged with yourself, did you find him there to meet you with your need? And the question to you today is a spiritual question. It's not a physical one. It's not a mental one. It's a question to your heart. Who do you say that I am? I hope you'll say that he's the Messiah, the Christ, the light of God. But only you can answer that question. For me, I'm telling you that's who he is. I've fallen so in love with God, there's nobody else I would rather serve, honor, and worship than the living God that Jesus Christ came to explain to us. Thank you today for listening to me. And today I hope that you too will in your heart believe that he is who he said he was. God bless. Have a great day.